Estamos en otro capítulo de la entrevista educativa. En esta ocasión tenemos la posibilidad de conversar con un invitado internacional de mucho renombre, con el profesor de Harvard, Richard Elmore. Richard Elmore es un profesor que es un cientista político de origen, pero que se ha dedicado a la educación gran parte de su vida. Primero trabajó en salud, pero después descubrió la importancia de la educación y ha sido un profesor de generaciones en Harvard, pero además ha tenido una trayectoria muy importante a nivel internacional, siendo un actor opinante muy incisivo y sobre las reformas educativas y también el debate público norteamericano sobre las distintas reformas que ahí se han llevado a cabo. How are you, Richard?
Fine, thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Maybe we can begin for something that all the time for me is an interesting question. Why do you decide in a certain moment of your career to abandon the traditional academia and to go to the school and work directly in the school? I understand that half of your time.
Yes. So I was trained as a political scientist and entered the field of education as a person who was a policy analyst or a policy researcher, that is, looking at the impact of state and federal policy on schools and districts. And at some point, I got very frustrated with how abstract and disconnected that was from what I thought really mattered. So I made a decision at first, to spend a day a week in classrooms. And through that, began to develop an interest in this whole idea of practice-based research and inquiry, working with teachers and school administrators to develop a disciplined way of looking at teaching and learning in classrooms, and to use their own skills in inquiry and analysis to build their practice. And that developed into a very large-scale kind of set of training activities around the country and around the world. But that also grew out of my interest in medical practice, because I had done some work in the medical sector, and I think that one of the big ways that medicine differs from education is that it does have a clinical practice called medical rounds.
You talked about that with the ideas of instructional rounds.
Right, which we adapted to this practice called instructional rounds. And the basic idea behind it is that people at different levels of competency, at different levels of the organization, get together in a single group and engage in disciplined discussion and inquiry about the basic work of the organization. In the case of medicine, it's how to treat a patient, what to do about a particular, what they call a case. And in the case of instructional rounds, it's visit a group of classrooms, focus on a common problem that the organization is trying to solve. It might be the inability to reach certain kids who are struggling readers, for example.
This idea of the instructional rounds is a sort of parallel activity, or is included in the natural and regular activity of the school? Is it sort of, for example, the teachers' meeting that we have weekly in the school that is transformed as a sort of instructional round?
What we try to do is to introduce the practice, and then we try also to help the school and the system in which it's embedded make the time for people to do this practice. Our ideal situation, and it's been a very strong belief for me from the beginning, is that it is not our job to make this happen on a daily basis in schools. It's our job to teach people the practice and then to help them develop the organizational structures and routines which allow them to build the practice. So it's very much making it part of the general life of the organization, which requires some fairly major changes in how the organization works. To set aside time, teachers have to learn how to talk to each other, supervisors have to learn how to participate without directing people. I mean, it requires some fairly significant changes in the organization. Partly because of that, we developed another clinical practice called internal coherence, which is based on a protocol for organizing how the organization works. So it collects data from teachers about their understanding of how the organization works.
And you have some kind of cultural resistance
yes.
of the teachers or
yes.
of the school culture, traditional of this kind of innovations?
Yes. And part of what we try to do is to teach people how to handle that resistance, how to build on the strengths of the organization, but also how to push against the boundaries of what people are used to. And I think we've been actually quite successful at that. I would say more successful at changing people's attitudes in the organization toward their work than we have at changing the actual work itself, which is another whole topic. But I think most people who've engaged in these practices say that it's changed their whole perception of their work, that it's the best thing that's ever happened to them as a professional, and that it allows them to be in touch with their practice in ways that they have not been able to be in the past.
You have a connection between this kind of innovation that you are working on with some idea of which is, I think, is very capital in your your thoughts about education, about the instructional core, at the sort of the space and moment for the change. I will read a little paragraph that you wrote. Say, there are only 3 ways to improve student learning. The first is to increase the level of knowledge and skill that the teachers bring to the instructional process. The second is to increase the level and the complexity of the content that the students are asked to learn. And the third is to change the role of the student in the instructional process. Everything else is instrumental. It's a strong assumption, no? This idea of instructional core.
The teacher, the student, and the content. And the corollary of that general statement about the importance of paying attention to what the teacher's doing, what the students are doing, and what the nature of the learning is that you have to be able to pay attention to all 3 at the same time, which for many people is an unfamiliar kind of practice because they're used to looking at teachers. And our whole teacher evaluation system is focused on watching the teacher, right? Rather than turning it around and looking at the actual work that students are doing and asking, the question we pose is, if you were a student in this classroom and you did what the teacher asked you to do, what would you know how to do? Because you can do a perfectly good job of teaching something that is very low level and not very productive for the student, right? And in fact, many of the strategies that teachers use to make the work manageable is to bring the content down so that it's easier to teach. And I think that that's one of the main challenges we're facing in all the schools we're working in, which is how to boost teachers' understandings and expectations about what students can do. Because I think my general sense is that we're asking students to do much too little.
Well, that is interesting. In your view, the idea of in this instructional core, you have the student and the motivation of the student also as a very important part of the triad.
Yes. Now, in my own practice, I think I've been, since I did this work on the instructional core, I've been deeply affected by the emerging research on the neuroscience of learning, which I think is beginning to tell us a lot about the conditions under which high-value learning occurs within the individual. That is, what are the experiences that people have when they are learning things that are powerful and important to them, right?
You think that it changed? This kind of discoveries of the neuroscience are changing our idea, or must change our idea of learning?
I think in the long term, it's going to revolutionize education. I'm not sure that schools are ready to even begin to grapple with or understand the implications of this. But over the long term, it has to affect, because we're now developing a huge body of knowledge that's really important and really focused around the conditions under which people actually do this thing called learning and what actual learning consists of. And I think many of our fixed ideas, even about what learning is, are going to change as a consequence of our understanding of this science and beginning to integrate it into practice.
And can you give some examples about this idea? It's very powerful that the neuroscience will revolutionize, reform the education.
Well, the best example I can start with is one that's actually a very old idea. It's been in the educational discourse probably since Plato and Aristotle, but the science is now starting to bring it into really serious focus. And that is that the affective and emotional component of learning is inseparable from the cognitive component of learning. And the way this works is that when you're in an environment where you have to do something, learn how to do something that's unfamiliar to you, the literal physical process by which that happens is your brain organizes itself in a different way around that task and that little bit of knowledge. And it does that through chemical processes called neurotransmitters which actually govern both the way your brain works, or the cognitive or the understanding part, and your affect and emotion about that. So a principle that you might derive from that is that the initial condition under which you learn something determines whether that knowledge will be available to you in the future to use and apply to something else. And it turns out that if you have a negative experience learning it, it actually wires that negative experience right into your brain, so the next time you confront that piece of knowledge, you have a negative response to it. It's much easier to do it right the first time than to have to go back into that negative experience and literally rewire your emotional response to the first experience.
You have a sort of obstacle.
Yes.
Another kind of obstacle,
Right.
which is not cognitive.
Right, right. This, which leads to a kind of corollary, which is in our very traditional education system, we attach an enormous amount of significance to memory. So we equate learning with memory. When I ask my students in the first days of class, tell me what you mean by learning, they typically focus on things you remember from school. It turns out that memory is very unreliable. And one of the reasons it's unreliable is that it's not just a bunch of facts and information stacked up in your brain, which can be taken off the shelf and put into a new situation. It's a combination of your experience as a learner, which is partly emotional and affective, and the idea itself, right? So that testing for memory, in some ways, is just testing for how badly we did teaching you this stuff in the first place, right? It gives you information about what people can recall, but it doesn't tell you much about why, if people struggle, having been taught these ideas, why they struggle after it's been taught. And what it does is it takes us back to really trying to understand that point at which the learning takes place. Is the student actively engaged? Are they having a positive experience? Do they actually have an opportunity to express themselves? Now, these are, as I said, these are not brand new ideas. They've been in the education discourse for a long time.
Yes.
Now we know why.
Yes. Yes.
Now
Before
we know
it's
why.
an intuition.
And it's the knowing why that allows us to design better learning experiences and better learning environments. Now, there are 15 or 20 examples I could give you of how neuroscience will work to affect our understanding of teaching and learning situations. But that's the kind of logic that you would have to go through. It's not so very different from the kind of logic that physicians go through when their idea of disease changes. That is, what is the fundamental cause of this disorder? If it's one thing, we act this way. If it's another thing, we act that way. If it's transmitted only by physical contact, we know what it's likely to be. If it's transmitted in other ways, then we know a better way to treat it. So our basic understanding of the underlying mechanism helps us understand better how to address the kind of issue.
It's interesting, your career and your books and your work, you have all the time a link between this instructional core inside the classroom and also the large-scale reforms.
Yes.
And maybe we can go in this direction in this dialogue, because you have a lot of criticism about the large-scale
Yes.
reforms, and you have some reflections about why they fail so frequently. What is your view about that?
Well, I think my ideas have become much clearer about that, and by becoming clearer, they've become less popular. I think that there are two main reasons why large-scale reform typically fails, or to put it the other way, why it succeeds where it succeeds. Because we have examples of
success too.
Massive changes that have happened that have changed the whole way adults and students think about learning, basically. The first is that I think that reform is focused way too much on policy, and policy is driven by politics, and politicians operate on what I call a very short time preference, basically. In other words, if you're an elected official, and if you can't make something happen in 2 years, you will have failed in some respect. Most of the fundamental problems that we deal with in the field of learning and education are what I call generational problems. They require a whole change in the mindset and beliefs of people over time. So if you look at the countries that have had the greatest success in changing the mindset of teachers, students, parents, and the public at large about learning, Finland, Singapore, Shanghai,
Ontario, Canada.
Ontario, Australia. They set out with an understanding that it would take an entire generation to do this. That in order for this to happen, they would have to trust a set of institutions with this problem to solve parts of this problem that politicians and policymakers could not solve because of the mismatch between the time preference of politicians and the actual metabolism of the system. And it turns out when you take that attitude, a generation is actually a pretty short period of time. Because if you just think about this as teachers coming in to a system who have a totally different belief set about student learning, if for every teacher who comes into the system, every teacher who goes out is replaced by someone who comes in with a totally different belief set, you have this transition period of real cultural tension. But you don't have to change the entire teaching force before the whole culture tips, right? So there's a tipping point issue. But you have to manage and control the flow of human resources into the system. And I think that when we stand back and reflect, that's the kind of change that has created big shifts in how education systems work.
And it's very difficult for the politician and the political system to sustain this type of reforms.
And it requires
generational
a
reforms.
very high degree of social trust and a culture that supports social trust. And an agreement that which is particularly important, I think, in some of these countries that have been successful, particularly in Northern Europe, that we don't know all the answers at the beginning. That part of what we're trying to do is to discover the answers, and that we won't be able to tell you right away what's successful and what's not. But over time, we will build a group of people who have good judgment, who can make decisions, who know the science and the discipline of their work, who can argue intelligently about choices. And I think that, so that's why I try to say that the first condition for broad-scale change or reform or improvement in a system is a focus on culture. Can you influence culture with policy? Yes, you can. But it requires a different kind of mindset, I think, than we have right now.
It's interesting also that you develop there a specific concept which is very influential now, this idea of internal accountability.
Yes.
Because you have a reflectionist domain that say, well, you have a lot of different kind of reforms, but try to push and put pressures to the schools and so on, but it's a kind of external accountability.
Yeah. One of my most influential professors as a graduate student was Tom Schelling, who was an economist, a kind of a strange economist. He did work on very interesting kind of what would be called behavioral economics now. And he wrote a famous piece called Doing the Right Thing or Knowing the Right Thing to Do. And his premise was, in policy we tend to focus on trying to make people do the right thing, whether they know the right thing to do or not. In other words, we use various kinds of incentives and coercion to try to get people to do specific things. The real changes occur, the real changes in state occur as a result of giving people responsibility to solve the problem and helping them figure out how to know what the right thing to do is. And that's where this idea of internal accountability comes from. It comes from my deep engagement with the ideas of Tom Schelling, which is, if you build an organization that has the capability to solve problems, they will hold each other accountable for doing the right thing. If you're constantly telling people what to do, you're actually inviting them not to take responsibility for knowing the right thing to do. And I think that that's kind of where we are in this accountability game now, which is we're frustrated that we put all this energy and money into trying to make people do the right thing, and they still don't know the right thing to do, right? Well, they don't know the right thing to do because we haven't given them the responsibility to figure out and the access to the resources to figure out what the right thing to do is. And I think that that's the struggle around what's the role of policymakers and politics, and what's the role of practice in improving learning.
Well, we have this fantastic possibility to talk with Richard Elmore, Harvard University professor. And now the last question that is typical in our space. And the last question, if you need to give only one advice to our educational system? What will be your advice?
I've just had to go through this experience myself because I've designed an online leadership course for Harvard University. And I decided to focus it on the next generation of leaders in the sector, not even necessarily people who are already in the education sector or the learning sector, but people in their 20s and early 30s who could be interested in joining an ambitious kind of revolution in society around learning. And I asked myself, what could we do to make this work interesting to people who are highly motivated, well-educated, willing to consider a life that's full of a lot of complexity? And I think that that's the way we need to think. We need to think about where is the talent in society that we want to work on this set of issues? How do we get them interested? And how do we make the work interesting? Most of those people are not going to want to work in bureaucratic organizations. Okay?
We need to recreate the profession.
So part of our problem, and one of the problems I'm working on right now, is how do we design environments that invite the right people into the conversation? Not people who are looking for safe jobs necessarily, not people who have very fixed ideas, not people who already know the answers, but people who have enormous energy, enormous curiosity, and like to do things. Like they like this connection between ideas and action. And what we've tried to do with this online course is to invite people in. And I think that that's going to be the major challenge that governments are going to face, because right now our definition of what the right thing to do is to recruit people whose ideas, understandings, and beliefs about learning are consistent with what the policy says they should be and what the existing organizational culture says it should be. And they're not going to be the most imaginative people in our society. We may need people like that, but the people who are going to lead improvement need to be risk takers, they need to be ambitious, they need to ask questions, and they need to be willing to upset conventional understandings about what powerful learning looks like.
Terminado aquí un capítulo más de la entrevista educativa. Tuvimos la posibilidad de conversar con el profesor Richard Elmore. Thank you, Richard, for this fantastic conversation.